Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Judith Reifsteck, the author of Memoried and Storied, Healing Our Shared History of Racial Violence. Judith has worked as a writer, licensed professional counselor, university professor, social science researcher, and psychotherapist. In 2016, she stepped away from teaching and psychotherapy to write full-time. She became interested in writing a book about racial violence and shared healing after visiting the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. This experience has led her to create a narrative that attempts to bring together racial violence and personal trauma themes. Judith hopes her work leads others to join together in multiracial coalitions to learn an accurate and inclusive American history. During her work as an individual and family counselor for 40 years, Judith worked with trauma victims, refugees, and those in recovery. The purpose of her writing is to advocate for the vulnerable who do not have visibility or a voice in their communities. You can learn more about all of her work at drjudithreifsteck.com. And that's Reifsteck is spelled Reifsteck. So Judith, thanks so much for joining us and congratulations on all of your work.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's great to be here with you today.
Same here. So to start off, what else would you like people to know about you than what I kind of rattled off there?
Wow. Well, that's thumbnail, I guess. And what else would I like people to know? I'm a mother and a grandmother. And I started as a therapist, not a writer or a historian or a student of racial violence. So my entry point to this material was through kind of intervention and healing. And I practiced as a family therapist in the school of therapy they call structural family therapy or systemic family therapy. So we frequently knew that although we were seeing one member of the family in the clinic, there were other members back in the environment who were just as broken or also needed help. And then through aging, my own self, and just my life experiences, that became more of the, not so much the micro relationships as it was the neighborhood, the community, the state, the nation. So that's kind of why I was compelled to write about this material.
So I mentioned to you earlier that I've got this new business that I'm starting called Find Your Next Calling. And so as I mentioned in the intro, in 2016, you left your previous career to become a full-time writer. Kind of your next calling, right? Is that the way you viewed it?
It is, with one little teeny tweak. I had written since I was probably 8 years old. Professionally, I had been a writer from 21 till now, but it was always for an academic audience or for the patients. So some kind of a manual, or I was writing about material that had to do with healing, therapy, developmental psych, parenting, abnormal psych. And so that was the turn. That was the twist. Yeah. Okay. And it's not the same thing. I mean, yes, writing is writing. So you have 40% of the skills, but there's a lot of other things to learn.
I mean, academic writing and trade writing are completely different. Publishing and everything else to do with it too. So
true.
I hear you. So as I mentioned, the book is Memoried and Storied, Healing Our Shared History of Racial Violence. So can you tell us a little bit more about how that book came about?
Sure. The book came about in an instant, just in a second, and it followed a 2021 trip I took to the National Monument for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, sometimes called the Lynching Museum, started by Brian Stevenson and his colleagues at the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. And it is there that over 4,000 souls are memorialized, and they are the African-American victims of lynching in our country from 1877 to 1955. The monument, there's a museum and a monument across the street from each other. The museum is a storehouse of records and archives, documentation that tell the story of race in America from slave trade days through Civil War, through Jim Crow, all the way up to the present day. But the memorial, which is outside and on the lawn, is a beautiful place that people walk through, where there are 800 steel cylinders hanging from the ceiling. Each cylinder, 6-foot steel cylinder, represents a county in the United States where a known and documented lynching occurred. And so it's a learning journey. you're brought into the topic of racial violence and the era of racial terrorism in the United States. Personally, I was impacted in the days after to come to terms really with how much I did not know, although I did know some. And, it wasn't the only civil rights trip I'd taken. I traveled many places and I had lived in Florida, lived in Virginia for over 30 years, really. So I was aware, but the more you learn about the history that isn't taught, the more you learn how much you don't know.
Mm.
And so when I returned home, I had gone to the memorial with a list of 9 names of individuals who had been lynched in the neighboring counties from my home, one of whom was lynched 13 miles from my house, Charlotte Harris. And when I came home, I became sort of dedicated and just immersed in writing about, I wind up writing about 4 lynching stories, 3 in Virginia, 1 in South Carolina. And then the second half of the book is about today's activism towards healing racial violence and how it's connected to this history.
Mm-hmm. So how did you choose the title, Memoried and Storied?
Yes.
Where does that come from?
Memoried and Storied is a phrase from a beautiful poem by Elizabeth Alexander, who was our national poet. She spoke at Barack Obama's first inaugural, I do believe. And this poem, which is called Invocation, is on display. It was commissioned for the opening of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And it is on display right next to this memorial in a large granite slab. And that one line says, "Memoried and storied, we still stand here. We will not be brought to extinction. We will not be made invisible." So it's a poignant and really beautiful and emotional kind of testament to souls that were murdered without any type of trial or hearing, and almost always killed for things that people later admitted they had not done at all. So the people who were committing the lynchings in broad daylight, more or less, no, not more or less, completely, and with the cooperation of the local authorities, knew that what they were doing was, we would call it vigilante justice today, but there was no vigilante about it because it was part of the existing justice structure that came up after the Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment eradicated slavery, chattel slavery. Local white people in the southern states couldn't live with what occurred next, and they took it upon themselves to commit these murders for often imaginary crimes in order to perpetrate fear throughout the population, so that a different type of slavery would last, which is what happened.
So you mentioned that the book includes stories about 4 people that were lynched. How did you select those 4?
3 of them came off of my original list that I took over there. So I live in Harrisonburg, Virginia, which is on the western side of the state in the Shenandoah Valley, not far from Charlottesville. And I taught at James Madison University, which is here in this town. And I was unaware that a scholar named Dr. Gianluca DeFazio had done a project with his students where he documented the 100 lynchings known to have occurred in Virginia. And on this database, you can pick any one of these 100 lynchings, locate where the lynching happened, read the newspaper accounts, because strangely, although it was justice and it was a thing that the authorities knew happened, it was suppressed from the court records, other kinds of records in the town. But the newspapers wrote about lynchings very sensationalistically. And so Dr. DeFazio has that database, and I pulled those names. So the 3 Virginia lynchings in my book, Charlotte Harris here in Rockingham County, Allie Thompson up in Culpeper, Virginia, John Henry James in Charlottesville, Virginia, they came off that list. And I wanted a personal, experiential, emotional connection when I went to visit the museum. So, and I knew that if I wrote about the stories, that would occur. And I would also meet other people that were involved in these projects that I write about to remember the victims. The 4th one, South Carolina, Lake City, South Carolina, was a man named Fraser Baker, who had been appointed by President Harrison in 1898 to be the postmaster in Lake City, South Carolina. He'd already been a very successful, skilled postmaster in a neighboring black town. Harrison appointed him in Lake City. The whites weren't having it, so they wound up burning his house, shooting him, killing him and his 18-month-old daughter. And that was the lynching that I wrote about there, because there are many similarities to all the other lynchings, but some noteworthy differences. His was the lynching that got Ida B. Wells nationally recognized. And, there are periods of, real peaks of interest. The NAACP was pivotal, but other groups were pivotal in writing about and making much higher level of awareness come to the topic through the years, ever since 1870.
So one of the things that is unique about your book is that you have quite a few color pictures in it.
Yes.
And most of the books, where I interview authors don't have any pictures in it, much less color pictures in it. And, I presume that's because it adds to the cost of producing the book. But why did you choose to do that, to include those?
It's a great question. And I'm so glad it wound up exactly that way. It was a bit of a bear chasing down the copyrights and the, original source and having the layout done. But it was important because this book was actually based on a prototype for me. At the museum, the Equal Justice Initiative, and this is very edifying and hopeful, I find, is very well funded and has a huge audience. Never well funded enough. I need to add that. But there's a huge audience of people interested in representing justice and shedding light on stories of injustice that support Equal Justice Initiative. So as a part of that, they have a wonderful bookstore. And I went into the bookstore and I purchased this book called Legacies of, I've forgotten the name now, but I guess maybe it was Legacies of Lynching. And this book is a picture book, and it tells 5 stories, but the photos are just so beautiful. There are photos of descendants of the victims of lynching, modern day African Americans who are searching out the historical story and then bringing remembrance, reconciliation, and repair to the memory of their lost loved one. And the text is secondary, it's the pictures and I had the experience of coming home and talking to my friends and colleagues about what I was thinking about doing, handing them the book, having them read the book, and I watched them pretty much be reduced to a different level of acceptance. People do not like to read, think, and talk about racial violence. Some people, I should say. There's a pushback factor that's very real. So photos are another way, telling the story, interviewing firsthand people. There are a number of devices that can sort of move you past those walls of fear or denial or whatever the walls may be. And the pictures are one of those ways. Picture tells, a story, doesn't it? In a way that words can't.
So you mentioned pushback. What kinds of pushback have you received? And, how did you respond? How should we respond to, just talking about the facts?
Right. Part of healing racial violence is being able to talk about it, and not just the violence, but finding a way to talk about race with the people in your life. And you cannot really tell a story and repair it until you're able to talk about the larger context, which is race in America. And what I learned from other people who had been doing it for decades, really, was to anticipate pushback. And I was recently reading an amazing book called Learning from the Germans. It's written by Susan Neiman, Neiman. She's a philosopher. She's an academic. She lives in Berlin. And her thesis is, she writes all about something called working off the past in Germany. And she writes about how they have chosen to memorialize victims of the Holocaust. And I love reading about it because contrary to modern day belief, they didn't come overnight to this thing that they should never memorialize the Nazi ranks and generals, and they should always keep the focus on the victims of the Holocaust. It took a long, long time and many events. And She points out the fact that when they finally got around to erecting, designing, and building a monument in Berlin to the victims of the Holocaust, they budgeted in money for the pushback and the vandalism they knew would occur at this spot.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big part of her book that's also about Mississippi, and she draws the correlations between what's happening in our country today with pushback and what's happened in Germany. And, I've been to Mississippi and Alabama many times, and all of these spots are vandalized or, they're the site of all kinds of, the markers they put up get shot with bullet holes. So this is kind of similar to what happened here it's not as extreme, but here in Rockingham County, we moved forward and we did memorialize Charlotte Harris with a plaque. It stands at Court Square in downtown Harrisonburg. And there was pushback in the form of a letter that was written by a relative of the great-grandfather, the man who owned the farm where Charlotte Harris was lynched. And essentially, I moved forward and had an interview with this man, along with a friend of mine who's a historian. And, he wanted to continue the family story about the event. So his pushback took the form of, you don't understand, this woman was a horrible person and a bad employee. And in the book, I write about what the specific pushback was in each lynching story. Mm-hmm. And so, although nobody likes to be told, you better stop doing that, you're wrong, which is essentially what pushback is, or to have some sort of misinformation, disinformation thrown up in your face. And because it's provocative and it's really an invitation to argue and fight. Mm-hmm. So all of these things are ways to be prepared, and reading about civil rights history so that you know some things that you can say. If you're like me, the first thing that happens is you want to run away, or you want to stop talking, or you just want to go, whatever, agree to disagree and change the topic. But you can't do that if you want to move forward and make progress.
Interesting. So have you had any pushback from any Black people?
Yes. And I actually get that question a lot when I do author talks. People want to know what that looks like. And my experience has been that, it's different depending on the person and what they've been through, but frequently Black people don't want to talk about it because it's too painful. And there is, you could call it suspicion, or you could call it honest need to know about who's telling the story, why are you telling it, what is the motive, mm-hmm. and why do you need to include me? Because I already know plenty about this. This has also been my experience, that which makes total sense, doesn't it, really? If it was your group or tribe or community that was being terroristically targeted, you would know the story, because you would have to know the story to survive. And many white people know a different story, like, well, they probably asked for it, or, well, they probably did a horrible thing. Or so the pushback, I cannot say it's the same from every Black person who's asked me the question, but I have gotten several comments about, wondering why I'm writing about it, or who's making any money from the story, or things along those lines. Or I really don't want to go here again. It's just too painful. And it's much more personal, which is another one of my points is, you can't discuss this material like from a third or fifth hand view without realizing how hard it would be if that was your husband, your son, your father, mm-hmm. who is in those insensitive photographs, or who's being written about by the lady from Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. So what is your hope that people will take away from the book?
Well, I hope to raise awareness about racial issues, not in the way that just sounded, but in a more personal way. Like for people to ask themselves questions with other people they trust. What am I doing? Am I doing enough? And these questions will come if we challenge ourselves to learn more about our history. Is our history genuinely and naturally integrated? Do we know what really happened from all points of view? I hope people take that away, like a sense of how does this make me feel to realize there's a big part of my American history that I may not know?
Hmm.
And what does that mean? Does that hurt me in some way? Am I being shortchanged? Are there doctors and surgeons and artists and friends who I'm not able to have in my life because they may be affected in ways by this history not being told or by the bad things that happened? So I hope people take away a very personal connection to race in America. And then secondarily, what's my responsibility to repair what may have happened in my name? We're all citizens. We all pay taxes. Um, so do you bear a responsibility for anything that happened? You may not be related to the people who held slaves or people who attended a lynching. Incidentally, you may be, because
Yeah,
when we do our research, we find out both white people and black people that were connected to folks we didn't even know about.
sure, sure. So looking forward, are there any other projects that you have in mind that you want to share with folks?
Well, sure. I mean, I continue to write, and I'm very interested in the obvious, the pushback we were just discussing. And I find that, we live in a country that did, in fact, allow people who committed crimes to get away with committing crimes without any kind of punishment. So that doesn't sit very well with me. So I'm attracted to stories of injustice and censorship. And in researching, upcoming projects, I learned that there's really a lot of change that's happening and it's still happening. And I have a totally different perspective on, even if it's legal efforts, flat out legal efforts to intimidate teachers away from teaching these things
Mm-hmm.
or facilitating their high school students reading these books, that there's a very active debate about that. And just as there was in 1910 from the NAACP, there's active representation from groups saying, no, we can't allow part of our history to go back underground again. That's just going to hurt all of us too much. So I write about that topic and many others. I can't really write without reading, so I'm always reading and writing.
Good, good. So again, the title of the book is Memoried and Storied, Healing Our Shared History of Racial Violence. And you can learn more about the book and all of Judy's work at drjudithreifsteck.com. So Judith, thanks so much for joining us. Again, congratulations on all of your wonderful work.
I really appreciate it, Brian. Thanks. Have a great day.